Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be with you today. My name is Tammie Causey-Konaté. And as Lacy mentioned, today we'll be looking at exploring collective and cultural trauma, discussing causes for trauma that include triggering events such as natural, man-made, and medical concerns. We'll discuss how collective traumas affect adults and children, and then we'll move toward what we need to do to create conditions to work through collective trauma in a way that is transformative for social justice and equity. We'll look at trauma-sensitive approaches and social emotional support. So in short, we want to help to reconceptualize resilience in a way that helps us to move beyond a goal of maybe getting to back where we were, to not only that, but moving past adapting to where we are to transforming to something that's really powerful, socially just, culturally responsive. And so with that, we will move into the presentation. So as we advance the slide, we'll see here that the term cultural trauma and collective trauma shows up throughout our presentation. And I just wanted to note that collective trauma is used synonymously with a number of different terms, including community-wide trauma, historic grief, historic trauma, intergenerational post-traumatic stress, intergenerational and multi-generational trauma, and even mass trauma. And so you may know this work by many other names. Also, as we think about these synonyms, there are other forms of trauma that come into play, such as vicarious trauma. We know that social media and news media really help us to fully empathize and appreciate traumas when we are really not necessarily personally involved. There's intrafamiliar trauma, and there's also secondary trauma. In those cases, in intrafamiliar trauma, you have an instance in which trauma occurs across family member lines or within families. And then when we think about secondary trauma, it's much like vicarious trauma in which one individual may become impacted in a way that affects a larger system of folks. And so we've seen all of those instances in recent times, I believe. And so today, that's what we'll be digging into together. We'll advance the slide. So we'll start with cultural trauma. And when we look at the definitions of cultural trauma, we see that they are very, I hear myself again. Cultural trauma occurs when we have members of a collective exposed to a horrendous event that marks them in a way that their conscious is changed forever, and their future and fundamental sense of self are also changed. We also have a definition that looks at cultural trauma as impacting the taken for granted foundations of both individual and collective identity in such a way that what we take for granted is shattered, thrown out of balance, and what is put into motion is a process to help us understand what happened, to assign a sense of accountability or blame someplace, and to begin to find a direction where we can repair or interpret the situation. Next slide.
And so when thinking about cultural trauma, it helps to understand some of the tenets, and one of which is sharing suffering among a group. So there's a shared suffering among a group, and that's probably one of the most obvious tenets of cultural trauma. But there's also an injury to the group's collective identity. And so members of the group could start to question their position in society. This could manifest as internalized oppression, feelings of self-doubt or self-hate, as well as an overall injury to cultural pride. Then there can be a disruption of things that are taken for granted, and this includes disruptions to our routines, our rules, beliefs, and traditions. And I know this is especially salient right now as we deal with the pandemic and we have school closures, businesses are closed, and people are having to modify routines and behaviors. And finally, there's a sense of security that comes along with having a strong sense of identity to a group or a culture, and when that group experiences collective or cultural trauma, that sense of security can become fractured or threatened. Next slide. Some other elements of cultural trauma include emotionality, and these are usually negative emotions such as anxiety, fear, sadness, grief, vulnerability. There can also be a collective feeling of resentment and a loss of trust. There is some positive emotionality, and these can come in the form of a collective feeling of hope. And, of course, this would depend on the cause and nature of the trauma and how it's being managed and discussed. There's a tendency to want to attribute blame, and people start to look for something or someone to blame, and this can be driven by the media, which also contributes to some of the negative emotionality. And then finally, identity formation process. Cultural trauma can interfere with the identity formation process as people may start to question who they are and their role in society. And we do sometimes see defense mechanisms, which can serve as coping strategies to help people manage their experience, and this can be in the form of something like artistic expression. So, for example, the pandemic has triggered new forms of artistic expression, such as online concerts, musical, and theatrical performances. So those are just a few examples. Next slide. And so as noted before, cultural trauma occurs when those foundational things that we take for granted are shaken. And so if you could take a moment and in the chat just let us know what are some of your beliefs, routines, and traditions that may have been shaken, the ones that you take for granted. And you can respond in the chat box. And while people see, you see secure future, freedom to visit and move throughout spaces like parks, job security, trust, future for children, having time alone. Great, lots of great responses. Next slide. So these are just some examples of foundations that have been shaken that are linked to the current pandemic. So as you all know, we've had to shelter in place. And as I noted before, schools are closed, businesses were closed for a while. We have to socially distance, which is not something that we're used to. We have to wear masks and wash our hands and sanitize surfaces. Avoid gatherings in groups, and I know there are a lot of traditions around holidays that people weren't able to be a part of, and now where people are getting tested and waiting for the vaccine. Next slide.
And so here we start to think about COVID-19, the pandemic, as a triggering event for trauma. And I'll just remind us that the trauma is not the event itself, right? So as we look at this graphic, we notice that cultural identities are already intact. We have these identities made up of our beliefs, our knowledge, behaviors, and previous traumas. And so if you click once more, we'll see that, some of the thought processes we have are that in terms of our cultural identity as Americans, we're brave, we're self-sufficient. Sometimes we even think of ourselves as invincible, and certainly as survivors. But when we look at moving into newly traumatizing events, such as COVID, our cultural identities are challenged. I remember thinking, out of toilet paper? Don't go to the hospital. Call my doctor first. What is this? And so when we click again, we'll see that some of the thoughts that come to mind are, we have to do what? I have the right to do me. This is a free country. And so in this free country, we see that our identities are challenged now. Our sense of collective identity is being challenged by the new trauma. We know now that over 2 million deaths have occurred worldwide, over 400,000 deaths in the United States alone. 95% of COVID deaths being folks who are 50 years or older. And we might say to ourselves, but wait, this is a first world country. We have the most medically and technologically advanced nation on the planet. And so then when we move to the next click, we notice that cultural identities are thrown into flux. We start to ask ourselves, do I really have to wear a mask? When is this going to be over? Where's the cure for this? And so in that, I remember hearing, oh, this will be over by Easter. Remember that? And even now in the new year, we're moving forward thinking that we're leaving COVID behind us. And so these triggering events, these thought processes, speak to COVID as something that has triggered a change in our cultural identity. It's moved from a space where that identity was solid and intact, so now it's being challenged and then in a state of flux. We'll advance to the next slide. So you see here that when we think about collective trauma, it's an entire group's psychological reaction. Not only that, but as it is represented in the collective memory of the group, what becomes really important is how we, in our minds, reproduce the event. What is it that we're doing to reconstruct the trauma so we can draw meaning from it? Emotionally, we see that it connects us across the globe. You know, having it be a pandemic, now we start to not only look at our local news and our state and national news, but we're looking at international news to get a sense of what's going on around the world. And so the sense of our functioning in a global village has become very, very accurate in many ways. We notice that it persists across lifetimes and generations. And not only that, but it kind of illuminates for us how connected health, medical needs, education, socioeconomic, political landscapes are in nature. Next slide. And so here, when we think about it overall, we note that the symbolic renderings are very important as we reconstruct and reimagine the event, and we start to arrive at understanding, meaning-making arguments for what must have been and also what should have been. Next slide. So when we think about causes, we've mentioned COVID as a triggering event, but any event that violates familiar expectations and ideas might be such an event that triggers or causes a collective trauma. We know, for example, changes in our access to being and our access to living and engaging in ways that we normally have, to our residents, our territory, to traditional foods, medicines, and resources, to things that we hold true individually and collectively in our perceptions of the world. If we think about atrocities or extreme adversities, they too become causes. Things such as natural disasters. I can think of, in natural disasters, we think of hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods. Maybe man-made disasters such as genocides, instances of violent colonization, slavery, acts of terror, human trafficking, and also health crises. We can think, not that long ago back to the Ebola virus, right? Or SARS or HIV/AIDS. So all of these become triggers. Also, when we think about the deliberate and systematic destruction of groups based on their cultural identities, reducing them to maybe the religion, ethnicity, or skin color that is thought of as negative by a perpetrator, that in itself can become such an event. And we can think back to things such as the Holocaust or the extermination of indigenous and native people. All of those instances can become causes or triggering events for collective trauma. Next slide. So in the chat box, as you look across these events that have in some cases become triggers for collective traumas, write down one word that explains your emotion about what comes to mind when you think about these. What emotion do you feel when you think about the California wildfires recently, Hurricane Katrina, the Thailand tsunami, the SARS outbreak in 2003, the Black Plague years before we were even thought of, right? HIV/AIDS epidemic, Ebola outbreak in 2014, COVID-19 pandemic, the German Holocaust, the Trail of Tears, the relocation and extermination of Native people, the Atlantic slave trade, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Parkland school shooting, the Boston Marathon in 2013, the 9/11 terror attack, the Pulse nightclub shooting, George Floyd's murder, Boko Haram, and the abduction of those 200 plus Nigerian schoolgirls in 2014. Yes, disbelief, disappointment, horror, anger. Yes, all of these are the emotions that are conjured up as we deal with those triggers for collective and cultural trauma. Next slide.
So collective trauma can have both positive and negative impacts. In terms of the negative impacts, there's definitely an impact on mental health and well-being, where, as people see their lives turned upside down, they experience symptoms like depression, anxiety, helplessness. Sometimes a group's emotional capital is just depleted, and there's limited energy or motivation to carry on with business as usual. And the psychological effects are not only for people who are direct victims, but can also be felt by those who are indirectly exposed also. And then you have intergenerational trauma. Communities who survive traumatic experiences may pass on their responses to younger generations. And this can be done through the stories that they tell about the event and how they experienced and coped with it. In addition, the behaviors they exhibit might cause the younger generation to behave as if they experienced the trauma as well. And in some communities, you might find younger generations behaving as if they're in survival mode, even though there's no immediate threat. And even family members who haven't directly experienced the trauma, that means they can feel the effects generations later. And I think it's important to note that, because the generational impact of collective trauma is something that's often overlooked. And as a result, the children or the behaviors of children who are survivors may be misunderstood and not treated appropriately. There's also threats to identity and culture. So a group's shared beliefs, their values, their expectations, and ideals can be shaken, challenged, and disrupted. And perpetrators of a trauma may also experience threats to their collective identity, and as a result try to minimize guilt or deny events or transform their memory of an event, because in some ways there could be a certain level of cognitive dissonance between the trauma imposed on others and the need to maintain a positive group and self-image. In terms of positives, sometimes we see social solidarity. So among members of a community that have experienced the trauma, there's solidarity that provides emotional support and fosters a sense of togetherness and sometimes leads to collective action that can strengthen social networks. There's also an increase in empathy that we generally can see after a collective trauma and for some time after. And there may be positive and negative social changes. we may be required to change policies or experiences and social norms. And I'm sure we all recall that after the 9/11 incident, there were changes to our transportation and travel policies, and some of those things are still in place today, over 19 years later. But some communities might learn more positive coping strategies, and cultural or collective trauma can become the basis for forging connections between different groups. Next slide.
So as we revisit the potential effects of collective trauma, we would be remiss not to mention that what we've been experiencing lately beyond collective trauma is cascading collective traumas. And so cascading collective traumas are defined as a series of compounding catastrophes. They may be historic in nature or concurrent, but what we know is that they yield stronger emotional responses with each new exposure. And so when we think about what we've experienced in the last year, the pandemic, which is a global concern, the race-based historical traumas that have been kind of brought to the fore when we think about the brutal killings of unarmed Black people, the videotaped death of George Floyd, the shooting of Jacob Blake, the really highly sensitive protests that have been going on as a result of social, racial, and political unrest. We've seen violence in the street, but on top of all of those things, we've grappled with extreme weather conditions, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, floods, and so even pestilence in some cases, right? And so all of these things together become what we call a cascading collective trauma. Let's go on to the next slide. So when we think about those, we see that those traumas challenge what we view as our sense of rugged individualism and self-determination. And we become much more aware of how important it is for us to think about now groupthink or collaboration and nurturing. So we are forced to think about how we care for our children, how we care for our elderly, and what are we doing around resource sharing. When we think about global interdependence, that's been illuminated as well. We know that our essential workers have been redefined in some ways. So we've come to really think differently about transit, farmers, service workers, who give us the access to those basic things that we need. We've also had to think deeply about undocumented immigrants and their experiences and how they are really weighing on all of us globally. We get to think about the role of families in terms of an individual's physical, mental health functioning. And so living arrangements become really important. We know there's lots of overcrowding, and we've seen a rise in domestic violence as a result. We know that substance abuse, depression, and anxiety are all associated with that and the extent to which those are healthy arrangements. We've noticed that the economic vulnerability and food insecurity has been revealed. So we know that based on, in many instances, socioeconomic status, some folks are overexposed to the virus, underprotected, unable to isolate, and relying very heavily on food banks that are having shortages, grocery stores that are having shortages, even stimulus checks that have been delayed. We look at the impact on marginalized citizens, right? And we know that it's been disproportionate, particularly for people of color, people living in impoverished situations, and also people of age, mature individuals. So apparently, when we think about what has been really brought to the fore in the healthcare area, we learned that only, even though Blacks and Latinos are really high on the list, as well as Indigenous Americans, we learned that 5% of doctors are African American and 5.8% are Latinos. And so there's this other challenge about the extent to which you see yourself represented and are, engendering levels of connectivity and trust in that medical area. We know the importance of digital connectivity. We've seen the weather events paralyze us in terms of power and Wi-Fi. We know the importance of Wi-Fi to education, to medicine, to service in every area. And finally, when we start to link racism and classism to this, we see illuminated for us stigmatization, labeling, scapegoating, violence, xenophobia. All of these things are emotionally charging us and adding to our sense of trauma. And finally, when we think about advancements in medicine and technology, we see that of those 400,000 deaths in the United States, 100,000 occurred since the vaccine was released. And so there's an uptick in the loss of lives. All of these things work together in what we call the cascading collective trauma. Next slide, please. And so here again, we start to think about what it means for us in terms of collective trauma. So these symbolic renderings help us reconstruct those arguments that we want to make and to think about what it is that we want to happen and what will happen, what we can make happen. In this slide, I want us to think a little bit too about what's happening in education. So we know that we are experiencing teacher shortages. Our teachers, many of whom are women, are being impacted to a large degree. They are not only caregivers in the school context, but primarily those caregivers to their families at home. So that's intensified by early retirement, the vulnerabilities in health. We see that in the public school system, we've lost 500,000 teachers. That was back in April. Also, surveys indicate that teachers, parents, and students are concerned about school. They're anxious, and they're becoming really not as confident as they have been. Among students, we've seen an increase in suicide and suicidal ideation among young folks and increased academic failure all across the globe, not just in America, but across the globe. And so these issues weigh on us heavily. The next slide reminds us also that we are in a state where there's a misalignment sometimes of policies that impact us at home and at school because we've shifted primarily to virtual engagement. Maybe in some cases we haven't shifted as rapidly as we need to when it comes to preparing policies that are appropriate for that blurring of the line. We know that there's a disproportionate impact, as we mentioned, on those students who are underserved, and we see that showing up in lots of ways. And finally, when we think about overall social and emotional needs, we see that this is an area where I know you're working very hard, and we must continue to work together. Next slide. Okay. So when we think finally about our sense of collectivity and our narrative as a collective identity, we have to really begin to think about measuring our true character based on how we treat those who are considered poor or disfavored, accused, incarcerated, condemned. We cannot weigh all of our efforts based on how we treat those who are already wealthy and privileged and respected. And so as educators, this is something that we practice every day, but it's a lesson that I think our larger society is learning and implementing as well in this time of very serious conditions. So I want to ask you, as we move to the next slide, how have you and your colleagues been affected by cultural and collective trauma? How have you and your students been impacted? And when we think about that, what is it that you would like to see happen? What are you willing to do? What are some steps you want to take as you move forward into this planning stage for the next year because it's upon us already. So when we think about commencement, when we think about end of school year, grading, testing, assessments, accountability, when we think about the summer and starting the school year all over again, what are some of the concerns that you have that will help us to move through this sense of trauma that we're experiencing together? How can we draw on the benefits and the knowledge and the understanding and empathy we all bring to this process collectively? Thank you.
Thank you, Tammie. I just wanted to ask, we had a couple of questions to come up in the chat box. So there was one person who entered queries around the physical effects of trauma and how physical health is impacted by trauma. So would you or Wehmah want to comment on that?
Sure, there definitely are physical impacts of trauma, and that's where you see folks with high blood pressure. The physical aspects tend to create anxiety within people, which, if it's prolonged, can lead to other medical issues that need to be taken care of, both mental health-wise, but also physically.
I would add that sometimes there's an increase in violence and substance abuse and depression and anxiety. We've also seen that students, it's been found that students whose parents are staying at home because they are infected with COVID or because they're quarantined because of vulnerability are seeming to experience this trauma differently, a little bit more intensely, it seems. And so all of those things come into play. The other group that seems to be experiencing trauma differently is particularly women who are undocumented immigrants. And so when we think about the fear of overexposure, but the fear of also seeking medical assistance and how to manage those things are impacting, as Wehmah said, high blood pressure and other kinds of things.
And I think it's also important to be aware that there can be a physical impact, because sometimes it sneaks up on you. You don't realize that all the tension and stress has been adding up until, a more serious medical issue occurs.
So thank you both for your responses about the physical impacts of trauma.